Welcome to Subscription Prescription, the podcast where you get the information you need to scale your subscription program. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another dose of Subscription Prescription, the podcast where we help you figure out everything related to D2C subscriptions. I'm your host, Matthew Holman, and today I'm honored to be joined by Wes Buckwalter, the founder and CEO of SeaMonster Studios. Wes, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks a ton for having me.
So first, I'd love to hear a little bit more about what is SeaMonster and a little bit of your background. For those of you who don't know, Wes is an incredibly talented developer, does a ton of work on Recharge, Shopify, across the entire ecosystem, but we'd love to hear a little bit more about the kind of work SeaMonster is doing and how you kind of got into this space.
Awesome. Well, SeaMonster Studios is an old agency in regards to agencies. We're now 19 years old, or we're in our 19th year, so been at it for quite a while now. Hopefully I look young enough that people don't think I'm super old, but I'll take it either way. Old usually means experienced. But we're a full service agency, so outside of e-commerce or outside of websites, we deal with branding and brand strategy, naming companies, creating logos, extending brands visually or philosophically, depending on maybe what your brand needs. We've dealt with things like product packaging or interior design for stores, things like that when you have a retail presence. And a lot of it's relevant to graphic design or decoration, but we've worked with architects to sort of build novel things and make stores look interesting and things like that. By demand, and especially these days since COVID came around, almost all of the demand we have is somewhere in the digital space. And even if that's branding, it involves something that touches the web somewhere along the way, even if it's just a logo that's being implemented into a new iteration of a website or for a startup. But we've embedded ourselves pretty heavily with the Shopify ecosystem. We're a Shopify Plus agency. We've been a Shopify expert and partner for many, many years now. I'd say probably since 2013, 2014, since the partner program came about. So have seen it evolve and seen a little bit of everything along the way. But we tend to enjoy the weird stuff and we're not afraid of it. You know, we've got data scientists on our team, WCAG compliance specialist, a really skilled engineering and design team. And so from a sort of soup to nuts implementation of a website, we can deal with the strategy, deal with the sales, deal with its design and making it look beautiful, or its strategy to a selling process. Occasionally we deal with things like acquisition, SEO, but we're primarily focused on what happens when the user gets to the site and what happens after that. And we tend to work with partners that are acquisition agencies for some of the magical things that happen on the acquisition side.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and quite a lot in there actually that I didn't know about what you guys get into. I'm kind of curious. I wasn't necessarily planning on asking this question, but as you're talking, since you've been in the space for so long and seen a lot of both offline and online, how do you see the ecosystem kind of shaping up? I mean, obviously you put a lot of chips down on Shopify Plus as being a partner. Is that where you see the future going? Is that where you're seeing a lot of like cannibalizing Salesforce Commerce Cloud and Magento and continuing that process? Or how do you see like the future of e-com tech over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think Shopify, in my perception, I guess, is the fastest moving player right now, meaning I think they innovate a lot faster than others. They've got a different sort of corporate structure and company philosophy on innovation that I think allows them to excel in those areas. I think they've still got a lot of growing up to do to compete with some of the biggest of the big, or, you know, when we're talking to super enterprise size customers, a lot of what they find affinity for in things like Commerce Cloud or even WooCommerce or Magento is I can build whatever I want, which of course comes with a total cost of ownership difference, you know, and I think where Shopify really provides some accelerated growth capabilities, even for the biggest companies, is in things like you don't have to pay 15 internal engineers to maintain your website. You can work with an
hosting provider and all that stuff. Yeah, it really is the cost of infrastructure. I think people do not understand. When you're small, you get sold on WooCommerce being like, you know, cheaper in the sense, but over time, it's actually a lot more expensive to manage, right?
Well, and something that I guess as a nerdy engineer that always troubled me with Shopify in the beginning was it has guardrails. It only lets you do certain things, and they have specific methodologies for things. And as I've sort of grown up as a company and as a developer, I've actually found to really cherish those guardrails. It lets you do things very well, and it doesn't let you build things that don't work, I guess, in a lot of ways. And maybe that's an overly simplistic way to describe it, but I really like the guardrails that it puts up in the sense that it keeps my website safe and it keeps them functional. It doesn't let me do ridiculously poor things that I think inhibit user experience and stuff. And so in a lot of ways, I've grown up to appreciate those things more so than find them a limitation.
Right.
But I think a lot of clients that are coming into Shopify from another system find those to be an intimidating barrier of entry more so than its cost or its capabilities, I think.
It's so interesting. Your description reminded me of a quote. It's called "The tyranny of rhyme that forces men to write their finest lines," meaning actual restrictions allow people to become more creative. But I'd like to ask you about that question of people coming onto Shopify and facing these restrictions, because I think it's a really good idea. Like, how much time do you spend as an agency in from a consultative standpoint, helping people understand that the tech they're trying to build versus the business outcome they're shooting for, right? Because I know in our space, we've seen so many times a strange request. And then you try to get into the why behind that request. And it turns out because they're just used to doing something a certain way because so-and-so back office wanted it this way. When in reality, like, there's a tech solution that gets them from A to Z a lot faster and easier. They just didn't know about it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it plays into a couple of analogies I use. Is sort of, my primary function I see is the driver, right? And so the company's the navigator in this case. Tell me what your destination is. Maybe tell me the points that we need to stop along the way, but it's my job to get you there. And so a lot of times, maybe I have a better map or I have more experience. You've run one rodeo really well. Maybe we've done it 100 times. And so there's some life experience that comes along with building sites for different agencies or different companies that potentially lends to the thing that you might need or the efficiency that you might gain from that experience. I think the other side of it is, just because you've always done something some way doesn't mean that we should keep doing it that way. And a lot of times with large companies, it's a question of person power. What does it cost you to do these things? What does your routine look like from an effort or a clarity standpoint, data integrity, things like that? And I think a lot of the things that we focus on in moving from a large scale platform to Shopify Plus, for example, is what are the outcomes that you need from the data that it outputs for you? And how do we create some connective tissue between the tools that we're implementing to share that data in a way that makes it more efficient and more valuable? And I think a lot of folks understand the value of data, but they don't understand the cost of the data. Meaning,
Right.
if I've got 12 systems and I'm working with pivot tables and crystal reports and things of yesteryear just to try to make my marketing data make sense to me, what are the tools that we can evolve into that don't force me to do those routines? And so a lot of times, especially when talking with a C-suite full of e-commerce managers and marketers, they start to hear this concept and say, like, well, I'm about to be out of a job or whatever. And really what it means is you're about to be allowed to do the job that you've always wanted to do. Instead of crunching numbers, you can do marketing. And those numbers are there for you already. And it just becomes a utility in your toolbox as opposed to you having to build the toolbox every time you need a new tool.
Well, it's such a waste of time where you spend so much time trying to collect information so that you know what's happening, as opposed to knowing what's happening and going and building new solutions in response, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, right?
I think a lot of the things I love about some of the bolt-on solutions as well for things like data are that when you consider the top of the food chain, the CEO or CTO needs to know what's going on right now. There's tools available for that allows you as a marketer or you as an e-commerce manager to produce that report quickly and easily, satisfy the needs of your boss's boss's boss or whatever, and produce the answers that you need to give in a much faster way. And so oftentimes it allows you not to have to give them, so you can focus on the job that you really want to do rather than just reporting. But it also makes sure that you have the integrity of the data where you can be positive that the answers that you're supplying are correct. And I think it benefits everybody in the ecosystem for a company. You've got logistics and supply, you've got fulfillment, customer service and support, and all of these systems can be connected in a really elegant way that makes everyone's life a little easier and creates some visibility to your customer or the situations that are occurring inside of your process, so you don't have nearly as much synchronous communication going on. You can have a bunch of data moving around in a way that makes everyone's life a little easier and more efficient. And I think it's a quality of life improvement that a lot of people don't really account for in the, like, if we just try harder, we can have whatever we want. And it's like, well, what if you could have everything you want without putting a massive amount of effort into it?
Well, that's such a good point. I mean, even a much oversimplified use case, like we had this recently with one of our clients where we just pulled their data and put it in a centralized location so we can track it a little bit easier for ourselves. And we saw a trend for one of our clients, and then we're able to respond immediately and make a change to the cancellation flow and saw an improvement. And I think without just that simple process of having the data in front of us, we wouldn't. I don't know how much time it would have been before we actually went and saw that or went and checked on that kind of thing. So that's just a simpler way of having the information at your fingertips, and then you can respond accordingly. I really like the metaphor you use of like the SeaMonster being the driver and the brand being the navigator in that instance, because I think that makes a great point of like you're trying to take them from point A to point B, right? So they know the destination, but you probably know how to get there better than they do. What are some ways that you've seen, both from a success standpoint and maybe like a friction or failure standpoint, for brands working with either SeaMonster or agencies in general in your experience?
Well, I think the biggest point of friction really is the agency ecosystem, right? I mean, you're engaging with somebody who wants to charge you probably as much as your attorney does to build something that's a temporary solution. You know, if you think about the lifespan of an enterprise website, it might be 12 months, 18 months, maybe 24 months, but it's sort of a, let's build this thing that by tomorrow we'll need new information for and new data for and new content for. And I think it's an intimidation factor is kind of the primary hurdle to get over, meaning somebody's always had a bad experience with another agency. And a lot of times I find if you really dig in without ego and sort of try to understand the client, a lot of times the thing that caused friction with another agency was the client themselves, you know, not letting go of something, insisting upon something that the agency thought would be a different way to go. And then likewise, I think the agency approaching the same response with ego of, I have always done it this way and this is the way I should do it. And, you know, sort of our technology changes day to day and there's growth that always has to happen. And that's, I think, what makes the agency life so challenging, is that it's my job to be on point with not only the things that are great for today, but what's going to happen tomorrow. And in the best predictive way possible, make sure that we're making decisions today that don't prohibit tomorrow from being valid, or that cost the company we're working for a bunch of money to worry about what tomorrow actually holds. And so I see that as always the most difficult part of the conversation, is sort of just gaining trust, doing sort of business 101 things I think are often missed out on in the initial conversations. And then really after that, it's a question of, can we find a way to work copacetically in a temporary format with a team that we're just getting to know, that we haven't quite got to the point where we can nod at each other and understand what that means, you know, those kind of things. And so how rapidly can we evolve this relationship to both create trust and know who's good at what, so each person can work to the best asset that they've got available to them. And I think every company's got a different set of people for that purpose, right?
And I was going to say, every merchant or brand is a little bit different in how they approach like changes. Like I think it's just kind of like a classic human thing where somebody says, you know, I'm really low maintenance, but low maintenance for them is actually incredibly high maintenance for somebody else, right? So like understanding like, hey, like, yeah, it's like, hey, like we're not going to make too many design changes, but too many design changes might be 2 weeks of like reviews and stuff. So it's just interesting, just for everyone listening home, like we work with SeaMonster, and like we actually were going through some of this just recently with a client where it was just such a great experience to be able to say like, hey, the initial scope was we're just going to replicate what you'd be doing. And we're actually, no, we think what we had is crap. We want you guys to lead the way a little bit with what looks good. And you have our creative license to do that and know that you're going to be able to do that well. But I know on your side, it's like, okay, well, if they're saying we have creative license, is that real? Or is that like, we're still going to come back with 50 changes, but you know, that's what contracts and stuff are for. So I really do appreciate that consultative approach, making it work.
That's a challenge for any agency, right? I mean, it's music to my ears to be told, do what you do best. You know, I think that's the perfect scenario for any agency. It's never really exactly that, meaning
it's not, right.
Do what you do best until I don't like what you're doing, or do what you do best until I have a different idea. And the unique challenge there, as somebody who might be a creative director type role, is figuring out, am I interpreting things effectively, and am I really listening to the client, and sort of, are we chasing the same goal, or do I just think that we are? And at what point is the right point to pivot away from a thing, like when you get a read that the client's not picking up what you're laying down, whatever that means. And so it could be a design problem. It could be a functional problem. It could be a misunderstanding that client thought something would work one way and you thought that they understood what you were talking about and they don't. And so finding out in the right way where to sort of pivot or explain to the client, this is how it works and this is why it works this way. And I think the why part is always forgotten in a lot of conversations. Sometimes it's why it works because it has to work this way versus why it works because I've chosen to make it work this way. And I think presenting options, but not only that, but showing maybe what the outcome of those options potentially could be from your experience is just as important. We can do it this way, but the unique challenges here are these things that will either be a future implication for your staff or for challenges in growth and things like that. And I think trying my best to sort of say, I can build whatever you want. I have no problem figuring something out, but should we or shouldn't we? And is that the responsible thing to do as a designer or developer, or even as a, thinking about your customers? And I think a lot of times, especially when you're talking to the bosses of a company, they think that they're their customer. And they may have been many years ago when they started the company, which is why they started the company. But they've grown up and they know only so much about their customers until the data can be related that shows them, well, actually, your customers behave this way. And like, we're working with a really big customer right now who's got what I would call is a very simple audience, meaning they're low quality internet users from a perspective of a high tech savvy user, meaning what does add to cart mean? Why do I push this button and the thing goes in and then I give you money? And like every time you message me, I think something is wrong. And, things that you wouldn't necessarily expect in a digital world. And they've chosen to make their website extremely simple as a result. There's a singular pathway to get to everything. Their customer service is a little more high touch customer service because they've chosen to understand their audience very well. And they know that that type of audience is their primary customer. And so because they've made those choices, they've built systems that surround those choices that allows them to be most efficient and most effective. And whereas like the Amazons of the world or something would look at this and go, no, there's a chatbot and, the customer needs to talk to a robot, or everything goes into a flow.
We're install AI to help them with product discovery.
What was really challenging for me with this customer initially was being willing to accept that idea, going like, no, these are internet users. They all use the internet the same way and whatever. And really, this particular customer has narrowed down to 5% of the internet's use cases, which happen to be one of the more difficult type of use cases. And so they've found methods to compensate for that. And as a result, reaped the benefits of doing so. And the savviest users can use anything anyway. And so we don't really have to care about them nearly as much as the ones that have challenges using the website, or that might need some coaching on how to put a credit card into a checkout process, like things like that. But what we found is they have, well above industry standard conversion rates, massive amounts of retention, and people who treat their website like a brick and mortar business. And I think they've niched themselves into an audience that appreciates that. And, every time I talk to them, they're, we gained 5,000 more customers, and we gained 7,000 more customers, and all these. And it's like phenomenal numbers that are, their acquisition process is just appealing to the right audience versus say just ads or just, Facebook or just social or whatever. And it's a really interesting thing to see. And had I not been willing to sort of step back and take a breath and kind of go, why are you doing these things? And how has it benefited you? And what have you tried that would be more likely to be a 95% of the internet use customers' methodologies? And they had answers to those questions. And had I maybe not chosen to listen or been willing to understand, I think we would have sort of
been a lot more
executed poorly, right? And I think I think that's a big hurdle oftentimes as well, is just setting your own ego aside as an agency owner who's run the trek a bunch of times. Like, I'm not just repeating this process for everybody. My goal is to make a unique experience, even if I am having similarities amongst sites or pathways or processes of some sort.
Well, it's so interesting too, because I think on the outside, we often will do tear downs or look at websites and you wonder why somebody's doing it this way. In fact, I remember one of the very first websites I ever worked for was years ago. It was built on Zencart, and it was like the most basic thing, crappiest design. And we all as interns came in, wanted to overhaul it. And then we saw the numbers and we're like, no, that's actually the user. People want it to look like a catalog. They're expecting it to look like an online catalog, not like a typical purchase experience. That's really interesting. And then I think too, I think from our side, from a consultancy standpoint, I sometimes struggle with recognizing early on the type of client I have. Somebody who's looking for me to tell them what to do, somebody who's looking for me to do what they want to do, or somebody that's in between. Because when I have people telling me what they want to do all the time, I feel like I'm working with one hand tied behind my back, because it's only stuff that they think is going to work, and then I can't use any of my experience or knowledge. So I'm curious, like how do you manage some of that, where somebody is just saying, like, so I love the example you just gave. They obviously knew what they were talking about, but in other instances, when somebody's saying, hey, we want you to go do XYZ, and you're like, hey, XYZ isn't going to work, or there's a lot of reasons why XYZ tomorrow is going to be completely obsolete and you're going to waste a ton of money. Like, how do you deal with a client who comes to you saying something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you can gain some courage and sort of ask, is this really what you want? Are you telling me what to do, or are you telling me what's worked? And, sort of try to decipher that in a plain conversation that doesn't involve intimidation or, my way would be better or whatever, sometimes works. Other times it's human nature, right? Somebody's hard-headed. They have a specific pathway that they've already preconceived, and it's up to you as an agency or a consultant to sort of change their mind. And the other option, I think, that's always available to all of us is, well, why don't we A/B test it, or ABC test these concepts? I could be right and you could be right. And who cares who's right? It's who makes the most money. That's who wins all the time.
Exactly.
And really, if we're talking about pure commerce, the person who has the highest conversion rate and earns the largest amount of revenue or the largest amount of profit relevant to their revenue is the winner. And they always will be. And so $1 million website that makes $500,000 of profit is just as good as a $10 million website that makes $500,000 of profit, except that you had to spend $9.5 million to make that $500,000 instead of 500 grand. And so a lot of times as a developer or a designer, we can sort of say, well, I think my concept will work. And if I really want to go big and put my money where my mouth is, I'll do this A/B test for you for free. And if it works, then you pay me for it. And I'm sometimes willing to take those chances, maybe not always, but I think the proof is always in the pudding, right? If I do know what I'm talking about, or my team is capable of building this thing that I think will work better, and it does, very few people will argue with works better. And works better generally means more revenue or more profit or some combination of those two things. If it works the same, that's really where we run into an impasse most of the time of, well, it works the same, so what should we do next time? Because your idea was just as good as mine, or mine was just as good as yours. And so what do we try now? But I think a lot of times that also helps build the trust in the context of next time around, let's try it your way. Or next time around, let's make your test the A and my test the B, or something like that. And I think that plays very nicely. And I think a lot of times in these conversations, the other thing that we often fail to recognize is the level of jargon and expertise that we bring to the table is often overly complex. And if it just gets simplified a little bit, sometimes it's a matter of understanding. It's not really, it's just good customer service, right? Not a matter of, is my idea better or worse than yours? What somebody might be hearing from me is a bunch of words I don't understand and then more revenue, versus I think these tactics of step 1, 2, and 3 are most essential to gaining the revenue that you're looking for. And so sometimes I have to ask, like, does it even make sense what I'm saying, or have I left you with questions? Is there anything that I can clarify? That kind of stuff. And I think as long as you ask those questions, people will then surrender the answer. But if you never ask, they'll just sort of move on oftentimes and go, I thought I understood, but I guess I don't. And that's really where an agency, I think, gets into problems, because it's like, well, you said you understood, or you appeared to understand, and we executed, and now we're at the tip of the spear of your project budget, and we need to fix this thing, but I want more money from you if you want more work from me. And then we get into an argument, or we get into a trust question or something. And so it's always a matter of, we're trading our time for money, and if we spend a bunch of time in a useless way, we need more money. And nobody likes that, right? No customer wants to pay more for an experiment that's going to fail. And so, I think the challenge I always find is making sure that everybody's really clear on the scope, how long it's going to take, where things can sort of deviate if we discover something new along the way, and why that has additional cost, those kind of things. And so I think a lot of agencies work like we do, which is billing for time and materials versus on a flat project basis. Because I think what I've found along the way is that I can build you a website for X amount of dollars, often turns into not the website that I imagined we were building for X amount of dollars, and we would rather have gotten Y for it. And so, a
Exactly.
lot of things that I struggle with too, and where my ego really gets in the way oftentimes, is I never want an unsuccessful project, whatever that means. And even if it means chewing into my own profits to bring success, whatever that means to the customer, I would rather do that than leave a project unfinished or
Hmm.
incomplete or unsatisfying. And really, a lot of times too, I think as that guy that gets to decide whether I light all my money on fire or, whatever, just to have a happy client, sometimes that's the right move, and sometimes that's ultimate failure, right? I mean,
Right.
if we're not profitable, we're not profitable, and that's always a problem. And so I think there's a fine balance to strike in the conversation about, we're building something that evolves over time, and maybe or maybe not, we know exactly what the destination is, or we'll figure it out as we get there. And understanding that the client knows what they're really in for and why things cost more. I think on the other side too, what we've run into with, let's say, well-funded startups is a lot of times, let's say they have $1 million to spend and they want to put it all
Hmm.
against their website or whatever. The question I always have to ask in the beginning is, well, what are you going to do about after the website launches? Where are you going to generate traffic? Does some of this money go towards acquisition or advertising or sales channels of other kinds or whatever? And have you chosen to invest wisely in our services as well as the other things that will make our
Right.
services successful? Especially when it comes to, I'm a new company with a novel product that nobody knows about, and I haven't been on Shark Tank, and I don't have TV commercials or web commercials, or I'm not on Rogan or whatever. Like, people need to find out about you, and that's oftentimes more expensive than your website. If you're
And
spending
people
30
in
to
those instances, they often want to build this like really complex, like the metaphor I use is like people want to build the Tesla right away, but they don't even know if the skateboard will work, right? Like they
for
want to
sure.
build these really complicated purchase experiences and how you redeem points and all this stuff, but they actually have like zero sales or very little sales, and so they have very little validation from their audience about what experience is going to work for them.
Well, and I think it's the, like, don't put barriers between your customers and their wallet and yourself, right? And
Hmm.
so the fastest, a safe assumption oftentimes to make is the fastest chance to check out is the highest acquisition or the highest conversion that you can make, right? If I can go from point A to cart to checkout to money, oftentimes that's more successful just because of its lack of complexity. And it's not
Hmm.
always true, but many times it is. And so the real question there is then, how long does that take somebody? If we get a 90-second decision-making process from an average customer, can we assure that we're educating the customer for the things they care about that increase their value understanding of the product or the service or whatever? Can we do it in that amount of time? And if so, are we successful or not? Other times there's a reason for complexity. If you look at average companies that do things like meal plans or supplements that are for people with specific health issues or
Right.
things that are like solving a unique problem for each of their audience members, there isn't just one solution for that customer. Just put this widget in your cart and you'll be fine. A lot of times it's, do you have allergies, or do you have a specific problem that we should steer you towards a unique product or a secondary service of some kind? And then I think the other side of it is measuring, well, if we sell 10 products and we're getting a customer to convert to one, can we get them to convert to 2 or 3? And how much complexity is necessary to accomplish increasing our average order value along the way that takes away from that 90-second window of decision-making process? And are we attempting to increase an order value at the sacrifice of conversion and those things play out nicely? Or are we, sacrificing total revenue because we want less customers who buy bigger amounts of stuff? And I think the answer is unique for any company, but most companies are all about volume. I want more customers with larger order values, with smaller acquisition costs and higher conversion rates.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't really maybe thought of it that quite that way, of it being, I guess you think of it so often as just such a quick little thing, like a cart fly out or a quick pop up to add this, but it is actually a friction point and can drive down your overall like sales volume. So you might be getting higher AOV customers, but you're not actually making as much money as you would have
Well,
potentially with that friction point.
something we've chosen to focus on as well, that's kind of a non-glamorous point, but I think also increases things like SEO quality and conversion rates, is building accessible websites. So meaning WCAG compliance is the website jargon. ADA compliance would be the brick and mortar jargon, making sure that folks with disabilities can use the site using whatever assistive tools that they're using. And so that could be navigating without a mouse, like a keyboard. It could be a screen reader reading information back to you. And the crazy thing about the United States anyway, is that it's a bit of the Wild West right now. Every different circuit court has different rulings on how things should be accessible. We don't have a blanket law that covers everything. We do have a standard that covers everything, but the application of that standard is then leveraged uniquely in litigious circumstances as well, depending on whether you're from Florida or California.
Right.
And so as an agency, we started to encounter people who were being sued for accessibility or lack thereof. And as we started to look into the number of clients or whatever, if you think about yourself, you wear glasses, so you have a slight vision impairment. So do I. You might be hard of hearing, or you might have arthritis. And those are simple problems to solve for. Make a website more visually capable of being consumed. Make a website navigable with a keyboard, because that's easier for your hands to use than a mouse. But then we think about people with severe disabilities as well: blindness, deafness, inability to use their hands at all. And, we have to make a site navigable in that way as well. And so a lot of times what that does is it increases the semantic nature of the code, but also applies things like closed captioning to videos. So the advantage I get there is when it's midnight and I'm shopping for something, I can actually listen to the audio without waking up my family.
Exactly.
There's benefit for fully abled users that I think gains you an advantage in small conversion factors. And really, the goal for most folks that approach us for these type of services is to prevent themselves from being sued. And there's a lot of sort of commonality amongst the lawsuits these days. I think the stat that my expert told me was like a lawsuit every hour, basically every day of the year is coming about. And they seem to move in waves. Like this month is jewelry, next month is supplements, the month after that'll be coffee. And so what ends up happening is these lawyers who have found a way to make a revenue stream on these type of lawsuits will hire disabled people to browse websites until they find flaws, and then they'll leverage a lawsuit where the lawyer gets the money. The disabled person may or may not truly have been your customer, but where that person comes from is a place of reality. Something like 25% of Americans have some form of a disability, whether it's something as slight as like astigmatism or something as extreme as not being able to use their hands. And so if you just put that in greedy business terms, why would we give up 25% of our revenue stream for a site that's not accessible? If you put that in, we can make the internet a better place terms, it's I've now built a website that has its doors open to every single person who wants to use it, whether I believe they're my customer or not. And the extrinsic benefits of that are better SEO, slightly better user interfaces on the site, a color model that's interpretable by everybody that has better wayfinding. And all of those things benefit conversion and acquisition along the way as well, and have the benefit of preventing lawsuits.
It's such an eloquent way to put it. I love how you laid that out. I could, as you're saying that, I'm like, this is going to be an amazing clip of how you're pushing for that compliance. Wes, I think as we kind of wrap up, I'd love to hear from you, maybe like a simple thing that you're seeing in the subscription space that brands are doing to either improve conversion or improve retention, whether we're talking something like an in-portal experience or how they're looking at, positioning the buy box or technical experiences, like anything you can pull from your branding and design background, just to kind of put on everybody's radar that they should be thinking about or paying attention to for this year to improve subscriptions.
I think I could get into the weeds on that stuff all day long, because I think in some cases it's very industry specific, but I think there's a lot of blanket things that can apply to anybody that I think aren't huge challenges either. And so one of the platforms that we work with most heavily is Recharge subscriptions, and they're pretty focused on retention. Obviously, as a subscription first style business model, let's say you're a meal plan or a supplement retailer and you want repeat customers because you have a depletable product, or even a beer vendor or something, you want somebody to buy your beer over and over again. It's making sure that, again, getting into the cart where the user understands what they're buying and the frequency with which they're buying it is important. So step one is, you can buy a 6-pack and your cost is $1 per bottle, or you can buy a 12-pack and your cost is 80 cents per bottle. So there's value in gaining more, I guess, and buying less frequently. I think a lot of subscription sellers as well are starting to realize that if I can ship somebody twice as much every other week, the shipping cost that's chewing up my margins is easy to deplete. It's better for the world. It's better for the customer. And finding that right spot where the customer has enough shelf space in their home, whatever that means, an affinity for the product, I think is a fine balance to strike, because 12 beers versus 2 bottles of vitamins takes up 2 different amounts of space, or you can only
Absolutely.
sell so many mail order laundry detergents. And then there's probably a shipping volume where you've passed the 50-pound mark and it becomes egregiously expensive to ship at that volume as well. So there's
Mhm.
this balance between what's the right frequency and what's the right amount of product where a customer doesn't get tired of it. And then I think after that, it's all about the post-purchase experience. So imposing things like SMS communication when a user would rather have that than email. I think a lot of people have flooded inboxes as well. And so something
Mhm.
like a simple short, your order's about to ship, change it if you need to, which is a functionality that Recharge has. Um, I've seen a very large uptick. And I mean, the stats are crazy. Like an SMS is open 99% of the time, where an email might be open 3% of the
Right.
time. So you can at least be assured you've got attention.
Mhm.
Um, and it also means that you can be more frequently communicating with your customer about things. They can change things more easily at a lower friction point. And then I think thinking about what are the steps you can do to retain a customer. Do you give them a benefit for being a subscriber, like a discount? Do you offer things like loyalty points or cash back? And I tend to like the cash back because it makes sense to most
It's
people.
easy. Yeah, it's
It's,
easy to understand.
spend $10, get $1 of credit, and we'll automatically apply that for you. So you never have to think about it. And that's the margin you were willing to give them anyway, because it's a frequent order or whatever.
Right.
Um, I think asking customers who are leaving your subscription if they know they can skip some time or delay it for a certain amount of time. I think a lot of folks are still ignorant to some of those things. And so if you provide a little bit of, hey, I really don't want you to leave, but I can push this out for 4 months when you're coming back from vacation or you've depleted what you've got. Is it really a question of, do you like my product, or is it that I have way too much of it, or that I don't want it right now because I want to try somebody else's pretzels or whatever it is? Um,
Mhm.
I think a lot of folks don't focus on that level of retention. And then maybe the final step to that process is reacquiring the customer that's already given you their
Right.
trust, like a win back style campaign of, how can I get you to come back? Is it a question of value or price, or is it a question of you had too much and so you stopped for a while and then forgot to come back? And so
Right.
finding a way to sort of gently remind somebody without sort of being super annoying, I think is kind of brings it full circle. And a lot of folks focus on the pre-purchase acquisition, but not the post-purchase retention as much as they should. Um, and again, it's the same thing. Like, we've got, what's the fastest way to let a customer manipulate their order in a way that they feel satisfied with? How can we
Right.
allow them to add on special products? Can we surprise and delight them somewhere along the way for their loyalty, whether that's giving them a gift or cash back or just saying thank you, and being personal about it? Not like, dear insert name here, thank you for buying stuff. Making sure that your marketing's on point when you're talking to those customers, and that you develop the best digital relationship that you can. But I think a lot of these things are really simple to implement, but it's a stack of a whole bunch of stuff that
It,
looks intimidating when it's stacked up.
it really is. But I think, yeah, I feel like you just laid out like a lot of just subscription fundamentals. But that the
For
problem
sure.
is that people get, we become a little myopic in what we're focusing on, and we forget some simple touch points. I mean, the only thing I would just add is like a cherry on top of what you said is like that becomes cyclical, right? Like when you're starting to collect cancellation reasons and testing win backs, you can take learnings from why people leave and apply that to like how you're designing the upfront experience to improve that, how you're improving those customer engagements and stuff. But I do think that it's really just comes down to focusing on fundamentals, and especially with that example you gave of understanding your customer, like earlier in the episode, talking about a brand that just understood how their audience shops online. Like it's just simple things like that are just so profound within the experience, but mastering them means that you could master subscriptions.
Well, and I think when you think about the ecosystem in Shopify anyway, if you're a Shopify user, it's figuring out, with the connected systems that I've got, my subscription platform, my marketing platform, or ESP, my Shopify customer base or whatever that's stored in Shopify. How can I segment those people into groups where I understand their behaviors? Not, for the most part, all of us do the same thing on the internet. We behave very similarly, but we all have unique affinities, unique use cases for products. It could be simply people who buy every 6 months and people who buy every 12 months. It could be big and small spenders. It could be somebody who appears to be a family versus an individual, and some of that's unique to your product line, but a lot of it's unique just to humans, right? Do we have a piece of demographic data that isn't invasive to the customer to understand how we can better market to them? And more importantly, keep them satisfied as a customer. I mean, I think the internet puts an interesting barrier in between us and other people in a way where we don't think we need to get to know them. They can just be some anonymous number that's worth some amount of money to me, and their demographic data is something like spent a lot, spent a little. Spent a lot is more valuable to me than spent a little, and so I'll market to the spent a lot people more frequently, or needs a discount or doesn't need a discount. Oftentimes people who only shop via discounts are happening because you're only offering them discounts, and that's the only touch point that you have with them. And so finding ways to differentiate your audience beyond sort of the basic demographic of money or gender or something is important. I think behavioral demographics are much more important today to a business that wants to differentiate itself amongst other businesses that probably all have similar products. And then, at the end of the day, figuring out where does your product stack with the competition, sort of, again, the business 101 stuff. Am I good, better, or best compared to anybody else that can buy something similar to my thing? And what's the thing that differentiates me in the messaging that I'm giving to my customers that convinces them that I'm the highest value for them for whatever reason? And so I think it's simple competitive analysis, understanding your pricing model, finding areas where you can sacrifice revenue without sacrificing profit, reducing shipping frequencies or making bulk packs or getting customers to buy in a different way potentially could be the thing that makes you the leader in the space versus just a competitor, I guess.
It's fantastic stuff, Wes. I feel like everything you say just makes me want to ask you 5 more questions. We could keep talking for hours and hours, but I think we'll put a pin in it for now. I want to thank you for coming on the show. For anybody interested, what's the best place to find you and learn more about SeaMonster?
So you can always find me on LinkedIn, but SeaMonsterStudios.com is the best place to engage with us. We've also got a director of sales and partnerships, Paul, who is always at the fingertips of an email or a phone call. Our numbers are on the site. Our contact form will get you right to us, but we try to respond within minutes of any time that somebody reaches out, but hit us up anytime. We also participate in a lot of industry events, so you'll probably see us around somewhere along the way. Matt as well. So when you're working with Matt and you want to work with an agency, I'm sure he'll sometimes point you our way as well if we're the right fit for the job. So you can always come to Matt and he'll find the best fit for you as well.
Awesome. Yeah, no, you guys are fantastic. Just absolutely fantastic. Well, thanks again for coming on the show, and for everyone listening and watching, thanks for tuning in to another dose of Subscription Prescription. Stay tuned for next week to get another dose to help you grow your subscription program. That's it for today. Thank you for tuning in. Please subscribe so that you can get notified when new episodes come out each week on Tuesdays.